What's up, y'all? I wanted to talk about whether or not weed is a psychedelic, and we'll also get into the topic of mixing weed while tripping. Welcome back to my channel for those of you returning. If you're new, this is a psychedelics channel where we get into all of the ideas and things that you encounter as a psychonaut, and we do really deep dives on all of these things. I also wanted to help like-minded psychonauts link up and help you find those other people who are passionate about the implications of the psychedelic experience. So let's talk about weed. Is it psychedelic? Well, my short answer is yes, kind of. I'll start with why I think it is based on my personal experiences. First of all, weed and THC is a lot stronger than it was back in the day, especially if you're talking about distillates and cartridges and edibles, and all of these things are extremely potent nowadays. So the experience and the high that you get from weed nowadays is really strong. On the surface, it may not seem like weed is a psychedelic, but if you look closely, you'll see a lot of similarities. There are certain strains of weed that give me this spacey feeling, and I love that spacey sensation on marijuana. And psychedelics, to me, give you that spacey sensation really intensely. Weed can also be euphoric, and it tunes you into the five senses. That to me is one of the biggest benefits of marijuana, is that it can tune you in to all of your senses. It can make you more sensitive to visual things, to touch, to taste, to smell, and can therefore help you enjoy the pleasures in life even more than you normally would. I feel like this is also true about psychedelics. It's just in a much more intense way. Especially also your senses can start crossing into each other, and it's a little more confusing on what you're tasting versus what you're hearing. They all kind of start to blend together famously. Weed and psychedelics can both induce synesthesia. When you hear something or you have any other kind of sensory input coming in and you have your eyes closed, it can turn into a visual. Usually it's some kind of geometric, cascading, moving pattern that you see. This takes a really high dose of cannabis to achieve, but it has happened to me before. It doesn't happen to everybody, it seems, and it doesn't happen often. So I don't want to speak for everybody, but in my experience, this has been true, especially when you're smoking the more heady strains with more of a head high. I've experienced full-blown visions from weed alone in my life. It's pretty rare. It's only happened maybe like a dozen times. I even experienced this one time after smoking some Reggie, just not hydroponic weed, just some regular old grass weed, and it still gave me a full-blown vision inside of my head. And I actually made a video about this. It was the time I was listening to the Beatles, and you can check that video out on my channel if you want to hear about that. Weed also works better, similar to psychedelics, if you take care of your set and your setting. This can affect the entire trip that you have with marijuana, and it can really help you either enjoy the vibe or feel really paranoid. The experience on weed can be a lot more pleasant if you're somewhere where you feel safe and you can vibe. And the opposite is true, where you can experience the equivalent of a bad trip on weed. Us stoners realize that the occasional panic attack is part of the game. It's happened to me twice after having edibles, and a few times after smoking it. Now that I treat it as psychedelic, I always pay attention to the set and setting. So let's talk a little bit about the actual scientific similarities between weed and psychedelics. Weed acts on the 5-HT2A receptor, which is normally your serotonin receptor. So this is the receptor site that all the classic psychedelics act on. LSD, DMT, psilocybin, all of those are affecting your 5-HT2A receptors, which can be found in the brain and throughout the body. Scientific evidence points to this being the receptor that causes the hallucinogenic effects. Cannabis also affects a receptor called the CB1R. So this is part of your body's cannabinoid system, and this is what weed is widely known to affect. So the combination of these two receptor systems that weed affects is called a heteromer. And the combination of these two, the 5-HT2A and the CB1R, these together create a different result than they would just one by itself or the other by itself. So I was doing some research about this, and I want to read kind of like a little summary of a study that I found. It said a 2015 study on mice showed that CB1 and the 5-HT2A receptors create novel effects when they interact. When CB1 receptors entwine with 5-HT2A, new signaling pathways fire up that lead to memory impairment, cognitive deficits, anti-anxiety properties, and pro-social effects. So it looks like the combination of these two receptors is why we get the less desirable effects of cannabis, like cognitive impairment and memory loss. Wait, what were we talking about? So just like psychedelics, weed used the right way can be a very therapeutic thing, but smoking it every day is most likely not good for your cognitive health. One of the things that can make psychedelics and cannabis useful therapy is this idea of dehabituation. Another way to say this is just being able to see things with new eyes. Or as Jason Silva likes to say, it lifts you out of your cognitive Kansas and frees you from the been there, done that's of the ordinary mind. By approaching some of our problems with this second perspective, including our creative problems, we can approach them with a new point of view and fix our thinking. There isn't too much scientific research out there, but it's off to a pretty good start, and this is what I could find. All right, so let's talk about mixing weed with psychedelics. Most people who already regularly smoke weed are pretty likely to do it while they're tripping. For me, I like to do it after the trip has really kicked off and I feel a good sense of momentum and I feel that the trip has been going positively and I'm in a good mood, I feel safe, and that if everything seems to be going well already, then I'll smoke. The beginning of a trip can be scary and uncertain sometimes, and for me, that just does not sound like a good time to smoke some weed. Some people, like Terrence McKenna, would smoke a lot of weed to actually kick off their trip, but that's just not for me. One of the benefits to smoking weed while you're tripping is that I found that it can kind of like help you relax and reduce the body load that you sometimes get, especially on something like acid. One of the other things is that they can combine super well to increase the synesthesia and the close-eyed visuals that you're getting, and it can make something like listening to music even more blissful. On the more esoteric side of things, to me, weed can affect the subtle body system, also known as the chakras. During my first big LSD trip, it was after I smoked some weed that I experienced the sensation of Kundalini energy rising up my spine. And in other experiences that I've had where I was doing a Kundalini meditation and I had smoked right before, it had provoked these energies and these feelings of the chakras. So to me, these things are connected. The ancient yogis of India, who were the first ones to map out the chakra system, were most likely smoking some hash, and they also had their own psychedelic called Soma, which today is unknown what that was. So all I'm saying is that it's very possible that this connection of weed and psychedelics and the subtle body possibly goes back thousands of years to the ancient yogis. I'm sure a lot of you have something to say about this mix of weed and psychedelics, so I would really like to hear what you think about this in the comments, so feel free to share your thoughts. My advice to someone who's never tried this before is to wait until you're past the peak of your trip, and if you do decide to smoke, only do it a little bit. And it's usually towards the end of the trip or the plateau that I actually start to smoke a lot more. And this can also be a benefit at the end of your trip because it can kind of bring back some of the trippier elements of what you're experiencing, and it can also help you relax as you're coming down from what can sometimes be a very intense experience. That's going to be it for this video. Hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to let me know what your thoughts are about mixing weed and psychedelics. And let's have a psychedelic 2022, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.